Before anything in your life went wrong, something quietly happened in your mind. You looked at someone else's life and decided it was the standard. From that moment on, your peace began to leak away without you noticing. Nothing was taken from you, yet you started to feel incomplete. Nothing was missing, yet you felt behind. Buddhism teaches that suffering does not begin with failure, loss, or hardship. It begins the moment the mind starts comparing. The moment you measure your path against another, you step out of your own life and into an illusion. In this video, we will uncover why you will never be happy as long as comparison controls your mind, and how letting it go opens the door to a calm, grounded happiness that does not depend on anyone else's life, success, or approval. 1. Comparison is the root of quiet suffering. Buddhism teaches that suffering does not always come from obvious pain, loss, or hardship. Very often, suffering is born quietly inside the mind, through the stories we repeat to ourselves every day without even realizing it. Comparison is one of the most destructive of these stories because it feels normal, logical, and even harmless, yet it slowly poisons inner peace. When you compare yourself to others, you stop experiencing your life directly. You begin to experience it through constant judgment. You measure your progress against someone else's results. You measure your worth against someone else's achievements. You measure your happiness against someone else's appearance of success. Without noticing, your mind shifts from living to evaluating. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when the mind clings to false perceptions of reality. Comparison is one of the strongest false perceptions because it creates an incomplete picture of life. When you look at someone else, you see only fragments. You see their success, but not the sacrifices behind it. You see their calm moments, but not their sleepless nights. You see their highlights, not their hidden struggles, fears, doubts, or losses. At the same time, when you look at yourself, you focus only on what feels missing, slow, or imperfect, completely ignoring how far you have already come. This imbalance creates a distorted view of reality, and from that distortion, suffering is born. Comparison quietly tells you that your life should look different by now. It whispers that you are behind, late, or failing, even when you are growing in ways that cannot be measured or seen. Buddhism teaches that every life unfolds according to its own causes and conditions. There is no universal schedule for success, peace, or happiness. When you compare your path to another person's path, you deny this truth. You judge a river for not flowing like another river, forgetting that both are moving toward the ocean in their own way. This quiet suffering becomes especially dangerous because it often goes unnoticed. You may still smile, function, and move forward, yet inside there is a constant sense of dissatisfaction. No achievement ever feels enough because there is always someone doing more. No peace ever lasts because the mind keeps looking outward for comparison. The Buddha warned that the mind, when left untrained, becomes a restless judge that never rests. Comparison feeds this restless mind endlessly, keeping it hungry and dissatisfied. When you stop comparing, you are not lowering your standards or abandoning growth. Buddhism does not teach passivity or stagnation. It teaches freedom from unnecessary suffering. Growth rooted in awareness is peaceful. Growth rooted in comparison is exhausting. When comparison falls away, effort becomes lighter, progress becomes personal, and happiness becomes possible in the present moment instead of being postponed to some imagined future. In this way, releasing comparison is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the beginning of living your life as it truly is, rather than as your mind thinks it should be. 2. Every life has a different path and timing. Buddhism teaches that nothing in this world unfolds randomly. Every life moves according to causes and conditions that are unique, complex, and deeply personal. When you compare your journey to someone else's, you ignore this fundamental truth. You begin to believe that life is a race with a single finish line, when in reality, life is more like a landscape filled with many paths, each shaped by different experiences, lessons, and rhythms. The Buddha reminded us that impatience with our own journey is often the result of misunderstanding how life actually works. Each person is born into different circumstances, different families, different cultures, and different challenges. Some people are given early opportunities but carry heavy emotional burdens. Others struggle outwardly but develop inner strength, wisdom, and resilience over time. When you look at someone who seems ahead of you, you are only seeing the surface of their path, not the invisible forces that shaped it. You do not see what they endured, what they sacrificed, or what they may still be struggling with in silence. At the same time, you may overlook the quiet growth happening within you, simply because it does not match society's visible markers of success. Buddhism often uses the metaphor of nature to explain timing. A tree does not rush its growth because another tree is taller. A lotus does not bloom sooner because another flower opened before it. Each plant grows according to the soil it stands in, the weather it receives, and the season it is meant for. In the same way, your life is responding to conditions that are specific to you. Trying to force your timing based on someone else's progress only creates frustration and self-judgment. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we resist the natural unfolding of life instead of understanding it. Comparison makes you impatient with yourself. It convinces you that you should already be somewhere else, someone else, or something more. This impatience creates inner tension, anxiety, and self-blame. You begin to treat your own journey as a mistake instead of a process. Buddhism teaches compassion toward all beings, and that compassion must begin with yourself. When you honor your timing, you allow learning to deepen instead of rushing past important lessons. Some growth happens slowly because it needs to become stable, not fragile. When you stop comparing your timeline to others, something inside you relaxes. You begin to trust that your life is not late or early, but unfolding exactly as it needs to. This trust does not make you passive. It makes you present. You still take action, but without desperation. You still move forward, but without self-contempt. Peace grows when you stop arguing with where you are and start walking forward with patience and awareness. In Buddhism, this acceptance is not resignation, it is wisdom. It is the understanding that your path is not wrong simply because it is different. 3. Comparison strengthens the ego, not happiness. Buddhism teaches that the ego is not your enemy, but it becomes a source of suffering when it takes control of how you see yourself and the world. The ego survives by creating separation. It constantly compares, categorizes, and ranks in order to define identity. Comparison feeds the ego because it gives the mind a sense of position, better or worse, higher or lower, ahead or behind. While this may feel motivating at first, it slowly pulls you away from genuine happiness and inner peace. When you compare yourself to others, the ego immediately becomes active. If you feel superior, the ego grows proud and fearful of losing its position. If you feel inferior, the ego becomes ashamed, insecure, and restless. In both cases, peace is lost. Buddhism teaches that happiness cannot exist in a mind that is constantly measuring itself against others, because the ego never feels satisfied. There is always someone ahead to threaten it, or someone behind to validate it. This constant mental movement creates tension, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion. The Buddha taught that clinging to identity is one of the deepest causes of suffering. Comparison strengthens this clinging by tying your sense of worth to external outcomes. You begin to believe that you are only valuable if you are more successful, more admired, or more accomplished than others. This belief traps you in endless striving. Even when you achieve something meaningful, the happiness is short-lived because the ego quickly looks for a new comparison. Peace is delayed again and again, always pushed into the future. True happiness, according to Buddhism, arises when the ego loosens its grip. This does not mean you lose ambition or direction. It means your actions come from clarity rather than insecurity. When comparison fades, you no longer need to prove yourself. You work, grow, and improve because it feels aligned with your inner values, not because you are trying to outrank someone else. Effort becomes lighter, and progress feels meaningful instead of desperate. Comparison also separates you from others emotionally. It turns human beings into benchmarks instead of companions on the path of life. The Buddha taught compassion and interconnectedness, reminding us that all beings share suffering, desire peace, and seek happiness. When comparison dominates the mind, compassion weakens. You either envy others or look down on them, and both states create distance from genuine connection. Happiness cannot grow in isolation, pride, or resentment. When you stop comparing, the ego begins to soften. You no longer need to defend your worth or inflate your identity. You become more open, more present, and more peaceful. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found in being better than others, but in being free from the need to be better than anyone. This freedom allows joy to arise naturally, without effort, without competition, and without fear. 4. Social comparison steals the present moment. Buddhism teaches that the present moment is the only place where life actually exists. The past is memory, the future is imagination. Peace, awareness, and happiness can only be experienced now. Yet comparison quietly pulls the mind away from the present again and again. The moment you compare your life to someone else's, your attention leaves what is happening and enters a mental world of judgment, measurement, and imagined alternatives. Without realizing it, you stop living and start evaluating. Social comparison is especially dangerous because it feels productive. The mind tells you that by comparing, you are learning, improving, or staying aware of where you stand. But Buddhism teaches that a distracted mind is never a peaceful mind. When you compare, you are no longer aware of your breath, your body, or your surroundings. You are mentally replaying other people's lives while neglecting your own. This creates a subtle form of absence, where you are physically present but mentally elsewhere, constantly chasing an idea of how life should look. The Buddha taught mindfulness as a path to liberation, because mindfulness brings the mind back to reality as it is, not as the ego imagines it should be. Comparison does the opposite. It replaces reality with fantasy. You imagine a different version of yourself living a different life with different outcomes, and you judge your current reality against that imagined version. This creates dissatisfaction even in moments that could have been peaceful. You may be sitting in safety, breathing calmly, with enough food and shelter, yet your mind is restless because it is comparing your present moment to someone else's highlight reel. Modern life intensifies this suffering. Through social media and constant exposure to other people's achievements, the mind is fed endless images of success, beauty, wealth, and happiness. Buddhism teaches that the mind becomes what it repeatedly consumes. When you constantly consume comparison, the mind becomes restless, anxious, and dissatisfied. You begin to feel that you are always falling behind, even when you are making progress. You lose touch with the small joys of daily life because the mind is too busy scanning for what is missing. Comparison also breaks your relationship with gratitude. Gratitude arises naturally when attention is rooted in the present. When you compare, gratitude disappears because the mind is focused on what others have that you do not. The Buddha taught that contentment is one of the greatest treasures. Yet comparison makes contentment almost impossible because it trains the mind to overlook what is already sufficient. You may achieve something you once prayed for, but instead of feeling peace, your mind immediately compares it to someone else's greater achievement. In this way, happiness is always delayed, always conditional, always dependent on external ranking. Another way comparison steals the present moment is by creating constant self-monitoring. You become hyper-aware of how you appear rather than how you feel. You measure your worth through outcomes instead of inner states. Buddhism teaches that attachment to self-image creates suffering because it turns life into a performance. Instead of fully experiencing a moment, you observe yourself from the outside, asking silently whether you are doing well enough, achieving fast enough, or matching up to others. This self-surveillance pulls you out of direct experience and replaces it with tension and self-doubt. The Buddha often spoke about the restless mind as a monkey jumping from branch to branch. Comparison gives that monkey endless branches. One moment you compare careers, the next relationships, then appearance, then spirituality, then happiness itself. The mind never rests. It never settles. Even moments of success are unstable because they depend on remaining ahead of others. Peace becomes fragile, constantly threatened by the next comparison. When you stop comparing, the present moment becomes available again. You begin to notice simple things that comparison once overshadowed: the feeling of breathing deeply, the calm of silence, the satisfaction of small progress, the warmth of being alive without needing to prove anything. Buddhism teaches that awakening does not come from gaining something new, but from seeing clearly what has always been here. When comparison fades, awareness deepens and life feels fuller, slower, and more grounded. Letting go of comparison does not mean ignoring the world or withdrawing from growth. It means returning attention to what is real instead of what is imagined. You still learn, work, and improve, but without losing yourself in constant mental comparison. The Buddha taught that a mind rooted in the present is a mind free from unnecessary suffering. When you reclaim the present moment from comparison, you reclaim your life itself. Peace does not exist in someone else's timeline, achievements, or approval. It exists here, now, in this breath, in this moment. Social comparison steals that moment again and again. Mindfulness returns it. This is why Buddhism places such importance on awareness. Not to escape life, but to finally live it without comparison standing in the way. 5. Comparison creates endless desire without satisfaction. Buddhism teaches that desire itself is not the enemy, but attachment to desire is the true source of suffering. Comparison is one of the most powerful engines of attachment, because it constantly creates new desires that can never fully be satisfied. The moment you compare your life to someone else's, the mind begins to crave what it sees. It wants their success, their lifestyle, their recognition, their peace, or at least the version of these things that appears on the surface. This craving does not arise naturally from your own needs. It is manufactured by comparison, and because it is externally generated, it has no natural ending point. When you desire something that comes from your own inner values, there is clarity and direction. But when desire is born from comparison, it becomes unstable and endless. The mind says, "If I had what they have, then I would finally be happy." Yet Buddhism teaches that happiness based on conditions is always temporary. Even if you achieve what you once envied, the mind quickly finds a new comparison. There is always someone richer, calmer, more admired, more advanced, or seemingly more fulfilled. In this way, comparison turns life into a moving target where satisfaction is never allowed to arrive. The Buddha explained that craving works like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. Comparison-driven desire works the same way. The more you measure yourself against others, the more you feel incomplete. You may accomplish goals, reach milestones, or improve your situation, yet the inner sense of not enough remains. This is because comparison does not allow desire to rest. It keeps the mind hungry, restless, and dissatisfied, constantly scanning the world for proof that happiness is still somewhere else. This endless craving quietly exhausts the mind and heart. You may not even realize how much energy comparison consumes. Every comparison carries emotional weight. If you feel behind, it creates frustration and shame. If you feel ahead, it creates fear of falling behind. Either way, peace is lost. Buddhism teaches that true contentment comes from reducing craving, not feeding it. Comparison does the opposite. It multiplies craving by exposing the mind to infinite desires that were never yours to begin with. Comparison also distorts your relationship with achievement. Instead of feeling grateful or fulfilled by what you accomplish, you feel pressured to keep going without rest. The joy of progress disappears because success is no longer measured by inner satisfaction, but by external ranking. Buddhism teaches that contentment is a form of wealth. Yet comparison trains the mind to feel poor, even in abundance. You may have stability, growth, and meaningful progress, but comparison makes it feel insignificant if someone else appears to have more. Another way comparison creates endless desire is by confusing wants with needs. The mind begins to believe that happiness requires matching others' lives, even when those things are not aligned with your true nature. You may chase goals that do not nourish your soul simply because they look impressive or desirable in comparison to others. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when we chase what does not truly belong to us. Comparison pulls you away from your own path and replaces it with borrowed ambitions that bring little peace. The Buddha taught that liberation begins when craving loosens its grip. When you stop comparing, desire begins to settle. You still want to grow, improve, and live fully, but the desperation fades. Desire becomes guided by wisdom rather than envy. You no longer need everything at once. You no longer feel that your life is incomplete simply because it looks different. Satisfaction becomes possible because it is no longer dependent on external validation or comparison. When comparison falls away, a quiet contentment emerges. You begin to appreciate progress instead of perfection. You learn to enjoy what you have while still moving forward. Buddhism teaches that this balance is the key to peace. Happiness is not found in having more than others. It is found in wanting less of what comparison tells you that you need. When desire is freed from comparison, it becomes gentle, purposeful, and fulfilling instead of endless and exhausting. In this way, comparison is not just a habit of the mind. It is a generator of suffering through endless desire. Letting it go does not make life smaller. It makes life lighter. It allows satisfaction to arise naturally, not because everything is perfect, but because the mind is no longer trapped in an endless cycle of wanting what someone else appears to have. 6. True happiness comes from inner alignment, not outer ranking. Buddhism teaches that happiness is not something you chase outside yourself. It is something that naturally arises when your inner world is no longer in conflict. Comparison destroys this inner harmony by constantly pulling your attention outward, forcing you to rank your life against others instead of listening to your own truth. When happiness depends on being ahead, admired, or approved of, it becomes fragile. It rises and falls based on circumstances you cannot control. The Buddha taught that anything dependent on conditions is unstable and a happiness built on comparison is one of the most unstable forms of all. Outer ranking convinces you that your worth must be proven. You begin to believe that life is a ladder, and that peace belongs only to those standing higher on it. This belief creates constant pressure. Even when you succeed, the mind does not rest because it fears falling behind. Even when you improve, satisfaction is brief because someone else appears to be doing better. Buddhism teaches that this endless comparison keeps the mind trapped in samsara, the cycle of dissatisfaction, because the ego is always searching for confirmation that it is enough. Inner alignment, on the other hand, is the opposite of comparison. It begins when your actions reflect your values rather than society's expectations. It means your effort comes from sincerity instead of insecurity. When you are aligned inwardly, you do not need to compete to feel valuable. You do not need constant validation to feel real. The Buddha taught that right intention is more important than outward appearance. When your intentions are clear and your actions are honest, peace begins to grow naturally. Comparison distracts you from this alignment by making you imitate instead of understand yourself. You start chasing goals because they look impressive rather than because they feel meaningful. You begin shaping your life according to what gains approval instead of what brings inner peace. Buddhism teaches that suffering increases when we live out of alignment with our true nature. When you ignore your own needs, pace, and limits to match others, the mind becomes divided, and this division is felt as anxiety, emptiness, or restlessness. Inner alignment requires deep listening. It asks you to observe your energy, your emotions, and your intentions honestly. The Buddha taught mindfulness not as a technique, but as a way of seeing clearly. When you stop comparing, clarity returns. You begin to notice what drains you and what nourishes you. You recognize which ambitions excite your heart and which ones exhaust it. This awareness allows you to move through life with confidence that does not depend on external ranking. Outer ranking also distorts your sense of success. You may be doing well according to your own values, yet still feel like a failure because someone else appears to be ahead. Buddhism teaches that true success is measured by the reduction of suffering, not by accumulation. If your life is becoming calmer, more compassionate, more mindful, then you are progressing, even if the world does not applaud it. Comparison blinds you to this progress by using the wrong measurements. Another way comparison blocks inner alignment is by weakening self-trust. When you constantly look outward for benchmarks, you stop trusting your own judgment. You doubt your pace, your choices, and your instincts. Buddhism teaches that wisdom grows from direct experience. When you allow yourself to walk your own path without comparison, confidence grows quietly. You begin to trust that you are capable of learning, adjusting, and growing without needing constant reassurance. Inner alignment also brings emotional stability. When your happiness is not tied to ranking, it becomes resilient. Praise does not inflate you, and criticism does not destroy you. The Buddha taught equanimity as a key quality of a peaceful mind. Equanimity arises when you are grounded within yourself rather than constantly reacting to external comparisons. This stability allows joy to deepen and suffering to soften. When you live from inner alignment, your life feels meaningful even in simplicity. You no longer feel pressured to prove your worth through endless achievement. You can rest without guilt. You can move forward without fear. Buddhism teaches that liberation comes not from becoming extraordinary, but from becoming free. Free from comparison, free from ranking, free from the belief that happiness must be earned by being better than others. True happiness emerges when the inner and outer worlds are no longer at war. When your actions reflect who you truly are, and not who comparison tells you to be, peace becomes natural. This is why Buddhism places such importance on self-awareness and intention. Not to withdraw from life, but to live it fully without measuring your worth against anyone else. Inner alignment is not a destination. It is a way of living, and from it, happiness flows quietly, steadily, and without competition. 7. Freedom begins when you bless others without measuring yourself against them. Buddhism teaches that true freedom does not come from surpassing others, but from releasing the inner habit that constantly measures, compares, and judges. One of the most subtle chains that binds the mind is the inability to see another person's success without immediately referencing ourselves. The moment someone else rises, the ego quietly asks, "What does this say about me?" From that single question, suffering is born. Either we feel inferior and diminished, or superior and fearful of losing our position. In both cases, peace is disturbed. The Buddha taught that freedom begins when the mind no longer needs to define itself through others. There is a beautiful concept in Buddhism called mudita, often translated as sympathetic joy. It is the ability to feel genuine happiness for the good fortune of others without envy, resentment, or self-judgment. This quality is not naive positivity, it is deep wisdom. When you can bless others sincerely, without comparing their life to your own, you step out of competition and into connection. The heart becomes lighter because it is no longer carrying the burden of constant self-evaluation. Comparison turns the world into a scoreboard. Every interaction becomes a silent contest. Every success story becomes a reminder of what you lack. Buddhism teaches that this mindset is rooted in the illusion of separation. It makes you believe that life is a limited resource, that someone else's joy takes something away from you. But the Buddha taught that happiness is not diminished by being shared. In fact, joy multiplies when it is freed from ownership and comparison. When you bless others without measuring yourself against them, something profound happens inside you. The mind relaxes. The tension of self-protection dissolves. You no longer need to defend your worth or compete for validation. You recognize that another person's success does not threaten your path, your timing, or your value. This understanding creates a sense of spaciousness within, where resentment once lived. Comparison also poisons relationships. It prevents genuine connection because it turns people into symbols instead of fellow human beings. When you compare, you stop seeing others clearly. You see them as rivals, benchmarks, or reminders of what you think you should be. Buddhism teaches compassion as a foundation of peace, because compassion dissolves the illusion of separation. When you bless others, you see them not as competitors, but as beings walking their own difficult and beautiful path, just like you. Another reason blessing others brings freedom is that it dissolves the ego's constant hunger for validation. The ego wants to be special, superior, or at least secure. Comparison feeds this hunger endlessly. But when you sincerely wish others well, the ego loosens its grip. You no longer need to be the center of every story. You become comfortable existing without comparison, and this comfort is deeply liberating. The Buddha taught that clinging creates suffering, clinging to identity, clinging to status, clinging to being ahead or admired. When you stop measuring yourself against others, you release this clinging. You stop tying your self-worth to outcomes you cannot control. Instead, you root your sense of value in awareness, effort, and sincerity. This shift does not make you passive, it makes you peaceful. Blessing others also heals envy at its root. Envy is not caused by other people's success. It is caused by believing that their success highlights your inadequacy. Buddhism teaches that inadequacy itself is an illusion created by the comparing mind. When you see your life as complete in its own unfolding, envy loses its power. You can admire others without diminishing yourself. You can learn from them without resenting them. You can celebrate without self-judgment. This practice also changes how you experience your own achievements. When you are free from comparison, success no longer inflates the ego, and failure no longer crushes the spirit. You stop asking whether you are better or worse, and start asking whether you are more aware, more compassionate, and more aligned than before. Buddhism teaches that progress is measured inwardly, not publicly. When you bless others, you reinforce this inner measurement and weaken the habit of external ranking. Freedom also arises because blessing others anchors you in abundance rather than scarcity. Comparison is rooted in the belief that there is not enough happiness, love, success, or recognition to go around. Buddhism teaches that this belief is false. Peace grows when the heart understands that another person's joy does not take away from your own potential for peace. In fact, rejoicing in others' happiness trains the mind to recognize happiness wherever it appears, including within yourself. When you stop comparing, gratitude deepens naturally. You begin to appreciate your own life without constantly checking it against others. You see your progress clearly. You honor your effort. You recognize the quiet victories that comparison once overshadowed. The Buddha taught that gratitude is a powerful antidote to suffering because it grounds the mind in what is already present and sufficient. Blessing others without comparison does not mean ignoring injustice or pretending that struggles do not exist. It means refusing to turn life into a hierarchy where worth is measured by outcomes. It means understanding that every being carries unseen burdens and lessons. This understanding softens the heart and brings humility, which Buddhism considers a gateway to wisdom. As this practice deepens, a new kind of joy emerges. It is not loud or dependent on praise. It is a quiet joy rooted in freedom. Freedom from envy, freedom from self-judgment, freedom from the exhausting need to measure your life against anyone else's. The Buddha taught that this freedom is closer than we think. It begins the moment we stop asking how we compare and start allowing life to unfold without competition. In the end, happiness does not come from winning against others. It comes from laying down the need to compete at all. When you can sincerely wish others well, celebrate their growth, and walk your own path without comparison, the heart becomes peaceful. This peace is not borrowed. It does not depend on circumstances. It is the natural result of a mind that has finally let go of the illusion that happiness must be measured. 8. Peace becomes permanent when you stop making your worth conditional. Buddhism teaches that the deepest form of suffering is not physical pain or emotional loss, but the belief that your worth must be earned, proven, or validated. Comparison strengthens this belief quietly and relentlessly. Every time you measure yourself against others, you turn your worth into a condition. You tell yourself, often unconsciously, "I will be enough when I reach this level," or "I will be at peace when my life looks like theirs." This mindset keeps peace permanently out of reach, because the conditions for worth are never stable and never fully satisfied. The Buddha taught that all conditioned things are impermanent. Status changes, success fades, applause ends, bodies age, circumstances shift. When your sense of worth is tied to these changing conditions, your inner peace rises and falls with them. Comparison makes this instability constant. One moment you feel confident because you appear to be doing well, and the next moment you feel small because someone else seems to be doing better. In this way, comparison keeps your self-worth on unstable ground where peace cannot settle or remain. Conditional worth creates a life lived in tension. You are never fully relaxed, even in moments of achievement, because the mind is already anticipating the next comparison. Buddhism teaches that this tension is a form of clinging. You cling to identities such as being successful, admired, ahead, or progressing faster than others. When these identities are threatened, suffering arises immediately. The Buddha described this as living with a burning mind, always reacting, always defending, always striving to protect an image of self. When you stop comparing, something radical happens. Worth begins to detach from outcomes. You no longer need your life to look impressive in order to feel at peace. You begin to understand that your value does not increase when you succeed, nor does it decrease when you struggle. Buddhism teaches that your true nature is already complete, not because you are perfect, but because awareness itself does not need validation. This realization is not intellectual. It is felt gradually as the pressure to prove yourself softens. Comparison also teaches the mind to reject parts of itself. When you see others doing better, you may begin to feel ashamed of where you are. You hide your struggles. You judge your pace. You criticize your limitations. Buddhism teaches compassion for all beings, including yourself. Conditional worth makes self-compassion difficult because it frames struggle as failure instead of as part of the human path. When comparison falls away, compassion becomes possible again. You allow yourself to be a learner rather than a judge. The Buddha often emphasized acceptance, not as passive resignation, but as clear seeing. Acceptance means recognizing reality without resistance or self-condemnation. Comparison resists reality by constantly insisting that your life should be different right now. It creates an inner argument with what is. This argument drains energy and blocks peace. When you stop comparing, you stop fighting your present reality. Energy that was once wasted on self-judgment becomes available for growth, healing, and awareness. Conditional worth also distorts motivation. When you believe your value depends on comparison, your actions are driven by fear rather than wisdom. You work harder not because the work is meaningful, but because you fear falling behind. You improve not out of curiosity or care, but out of anxiety. Buddhism teaches that actions rooted in fear lead to suffering, even when they appear successful. When worth is no longer conditional, motivation becomes healthier. You act because it aligns with your values, not because you are trying to escape feelings of inadequacy. Another way comparison blocks lasting peace is by preventing rest. When your worth depends on achievement or comparison, rest feels dangerous. Slowing down feels like losing ground. Buddhism teaches that rest and stillness are essential for clarity and insight. A mind that never rests cannot see clearly. When you stop comparing, rest becomes safe again. You no longer feel guilty for pausing. You understand that your value does not disappear when you stop performing. The Buddha taught that liberation comes from seeing through illusions. One of the most powerful illusions is the belief that you must become something else to be worthy of peace. Comparison reinforces this illusion daily. It suggests that peace exists at a higher level, in a better version of you, living a more impressive life. Buddhism teaches the opposite. Peace is not found by becoming more. It is found by letting go of what you falsely believe you must be. As comparison fades, a stable sense of self-respect emerges. This is not arrogance or pride. It is a quiet dignity that does not depend on praise or approval. You begin to treat yourself with patience. You forgive mistakes more easily. You acknowledge effort even when results are slow. This self-respect creates emotional stability because it is no longer vulnerable to every external comparison. Permanent peace, in the Buddhist sense, does not mean life becomes free of challenges. It means challenges no longer threaten your sense of worth. You can fail without collapsing. You can succeed without becoming attached. You can grow without despising where you started. This stability is only possible when worth is unconditional. When you stop making your worth conditional on comparison, life becomes simpler. You no longer need to monitor how you rank. You no longer need to explain your pace. you no longer need to justify your path. You are free to live honestly, imperfectly, and sincerely. Buddhism teaches that this freedom is closer than we think. It is not achieved by adding something new, but by removing the habit of comparison that made peace conditional in the first place. In the end, happiness becomes steady not because everything goes your way, but because your worth is no longer tied to how things go. This is the kind of peace the Buddha pointed to, a peace that does not compete, a peace that does not compare, a peace that remains simply because you have stopped placing conditions on your right to exist, to learn, and to be at peace. 9. Liberation begins when you see comparison as a mental habit, not a truth. Buddhism teaches that freedom does not come from changing the world outside, but from understanding the mind inside. One of the most important realizations on the path to liberation is seeing that comparison is not reality. It is a habit of the mind. It feels convincing, logical, and automatic, but it is still only a pattern of thought. When you believe comparison is truth, it controls you. When you see it as a mental habit, it begins to lose its power. This shift in understanding is where real freedom starts. The Buddha taught that the mind creates suffering when it mistakes thoughts for facts. Comparison is one of the most persistent examples of this mistake. The mind compares constantly, not because comparison is accurate, but because it is conditioned to do so. From childhood, you are taught to measure yourself through grades, rankings, approval, and social standards. Over time, comparison becomes automatic. It arises before you even question it. You see someone else's success, and instantly the mind produces a story about what that means for you. Buddhism teaches that awakening begins when you notice these stories without believing them. When comparison is unconscious, it feels personal and absolute. You think, "I am behind," or "I am not good enough," as if these thoughts describe an objective reality. But the Buddha taught that thoughts arise due to conditions, not because they are true. Comparison arises because the mind has been trained to evaluate and rank, not because your worth is actually lacking. When you observe comparison instead of identifying with it, a small gap appears. In that gap, freedom begins. This is why mindfulness is so central in Buddhism. Mindfulness allows you to watch the mind without being dragged by it. When a comparing thought arises, instead of following it, you simply notice it. You see how quickly the mind jumps to judgment. You notice how it creates tension in the body, tightness in the chest, or heaviness in the heart. The Buddha taught that awareness itself is healing. When comparison is seen clearly, it no longer operates invisibly. Seeing comparison as a habit also helps dissolve shame. When you believe comparison reflects truth, every moment of feeling behind feels like a personal failure. But when you understand that comparison is just a conditioned response, self-blame weakens. You realize that the pain is not caused by who you are, but by a mental process that can be unlearned. Buddhism teaches compassion toward the self, precisely because the mind has been shaped by countless influences beyond your control. Another powerful insight Buddhism offers is that comparison depends on concepts, not direct experience. In direct experience, there is only breathing, seeing, hearing, feeling, and thinking. Comparison exists only in conceptual thought, where the mind creates labels like success, failure, ahead, and behind. The Buddha taught that liberation comes from returning to direct experience again and again. When you rest in what is actually happening, comparison has no ground to stand on. The mind often resists this insight because comparison gives it a sense of control. It feels safer to measure and judge than to rest in uncertainty. Buddhism teaches that the mind clings to comparison because it fears not knowing where it stands. But this fear itself is a source of suffering. When you stop needing to define your position, a deeper trust in life begins to grow. You learn to move forward without constantly checking how you compare. Seeing comparison as a habit also changes how you relate to others. Instead of reacting with envy or insecurity, you begin to observe the mental movement itself. You notice how quickly the mind wants to turn another person's life into a mirror for your own. This awareness creates space. In that space, compassion can arise. You no longer need to diminish yourself or others. You can simply acknowledge, this is a comparing thought, and let it pass. The Buddha taught that liberation is not the absence of thoughts, but freedom from attachment to them. Comparison may still arise, but it no longer defines you. It no longer dictates your emotions or actions. You stop building your identity around fleeting mental evaluations. This is a profound shift. Instead of living inside the mind's commentary, you begin living in awareness itself. Another aspect of liberation is recognizing impermanence. Comparison assumes stability, as if positions in life are fixed. Buddhism teaches that everything is constantly changing. Today's success becomes tomorrow's struggle. Today's advantage becomes tomorrow's burden. When you deeply understand impermanence, comparison loses its seriousness. You no longer take it as a final verdict on your worth or direction. You see it as a temporary mental event, arising and passing like everything else. As this understanding deepens, the emotional charge of comparison weakens. You may still notice others' achievements, but they no longer trigger inner collapse or urgency. You feel less pushed, less pressured, less divided. The Buddha taught that peace arises when the mind stops clinging to views. Comparison is a view. Letting go of it does not make you lost. It makes you free. Liberation also means reclaiming your attention. Comparison steals attention by constantly redirecting it outward. When you see comparison clearly, attention returns inward, not in a self-absorbed way, but in a grounded way. You become aware of your breath, your body, your intentions, and your effort. Buddhism teaches that right effort is effort guided by awareness, not by comparison. When attention is reclaimed, life feels more intimate and real. Over time, seeing comparison as a habit rewires the mind. The habit weakens through repeated awareness. You stop feeding it with belief and reaction. This does not happen overnight. The Buddha taught patience and consistency. Each time you notice comparison without following it, you loosen its grip. Each time you return to the present, you strengthen freedom. Eventually, something shifts at a deeper level. You no longer ask, "How do I compare?" as often. The question loses its urgency. You begin to ask different questions, rooted in wisdom rather than insecurity. Am I acting with awareness? Am I responding with compassion? Am I learning from this moment? These questions lead toward liberation, not suffering. In the end, Buddhism teaches that awakening is not about becoming someone special, it is about seeing clearly. When you see comparison for what it truly is, a mental habit conditioned by the past, you stop treating it as a truth that defines you. This seeing is freedom. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and steady. A freedom that grows each time you choose awareness over comparison and presence over judgment. 10. Happiness becomes natural when you stop fighting who you are right now. Buddhism teaches that the deepest peace arises not from changing who you are, but from ending the inner war against who you are right now. Comparison fuels this inner war endlessly. It convinces you that your current self is not acceptable, not advanced enough, not successful enough, not calm enough, and not worthy of peace yet. As long as this belief exists, happiness feels like something you must earn in the future rather than something you can experience in the present. The Buddha taught that suffering continues as long as we reject our present reality, especially when that rejection is directed inward. When you compare yourself to others, you unconsciously create an image of who you think you should be. This image becomes a standard you constantly fall short of. Even when you grow, the image moves further away. Buddhism teaches that the self you are chasing is an illusion created by the mind. It is not real, stable, or reachable because it is built from comparison, expectation, and fear. Fighting yourself in order to become this imagined version only deepens suffering. This inner resistance shows up in many subtle ways. You criticize your pace, you judge your emotions, you feel ashamed of your struggles. You suppress parts of yourself that do not fit the image you think you must live up to. Buddhism teaches that what you resist persists. The more you fight your present self, the stronger the tension becomes. Happiness cannot arise in a mind that is constantly rejecting its own experience. The Buddha taught acceptance not as giving up, but as seeing clearly without hatred or judgment. Acceptance means allowing yourself to be exactly as you are in this moment, while still remaining open to growth. Comparison blocks acceptance by constantly suggesting that now is wrong and later will be right. This belief keeps happiness permanently postponed. You tell yourself, "I'll be happy when I catch up. I'll be peaceful when I'm more like them," or "I'll feel worthy when I reach that level." Buddhism teaches that this mindset guarantees dissatisfaction because the mind will always create another condition. When you stop comparing, acceptance begins to feel safe. You allow yourself to be a work in progress without seeing that as a flaw. You understand that confusion, doubt, and struggle are not signs of failure, but natural parts of the human path. The Buddha reminded his followers that even awakening unfolds gradually. No one wakes up all at once. Growth requires patience, kindness, and trust in the process. Another way comparison fuels self-rejection is by disconnecting you from your own strengths. When you focus on how others are better, you overlook what you already carry within you. Buddhism teaches that every being has Buddha nature, an inherent capacity for awareness and wisdom. Comparison hides this truth by focusing only on what appears lacking. When you stop comparing, you begin to notice your resilience, your effort, your sincerity, and your quiet progress. This recognition builds self-respect, which is essential for lasting peace. Happiness becomes natural when effort is no longer driven by self-hatred. Comparison often disguises itself as motivation, but motivation rooted in comparison is fueled by fear and inadequacy. You push yourself not because you care for your life, but because you feel you are not enough. Buddhism teaches that actions rooted in aversion create suffering, even when they lead to success. When you stop fighting yourself, effort becomes gentler and more sustainable. You still grow, but without inner violence. The Buddha also taught that the self is not a fixed thing. It is a process, constantly changing. Comparison treats the self as a permanent object that can be ranked and judged. This misunderstanding creates rigidity and fear. When you see yourself as a process rather than a product, comparison loses its grip. You stop asking whether you are good enough and start observing how you are changing, learning, and responding to life. This shift brings curiosity instead of judgment. Stopping the fight with yourself also restores emotional honesty. Comparison encourages suppression. You hide sadness because others seem happier. You dismiss your struggles because others appear stronger. Buddhism teaches that denying emotion increases suffering. When you stop comparing, you allow emotions to arise without labeling them as failures. Sadness becomes something to understand, not something to escape. Joy becomes something to appreciate, not something to measure. This emotional honesty creates inner harmony. Happiness becomes steady when you no longer depend on external permission to feel at peace. Comparison keeps you waiting for approval, success, or validation before allowing yourself to relax. Buddhism teaches that peace is not a reward. It is a natural state that appears when resistance ends. When you stop fighting who you are, the nervous system calms, the mind softens, the heart opens. This is not because life becomes perfect, but because you stop making perfection a requirement for peace. Another profound effect of ending self-conflict is freedom from constant self-monitoring. Comparison turns the mind into a judge watching every move, evaluating whether you are doing enough, becoming enough, or matching up. This surveillance is exhausting. Buddhism teaches that awareness is different from judgment. Awareness observes with kindness, judgment observes with hostility. When you stop comparing, awareness replaces judgment, and the mind finally rests. Over time, this resting mind begins to experience a deeper joy, not excitement or pride, but a quiet sense of okayness. You feel at home in yourself. You no longer feel like you must escape who you are to deserve happiness. This sense of home is what the Buddha pointed to when he spoke of liberation. Liberation is not becoming someone else. It is being free from the belief that you must. In the end, happiness becomes natural when comparison falls away because nothing inside you is being rejected anymore. You allow yourself to exist, to learn, to stumble, and to grow without condemnation. Life no longer feels like a test you are failing. It feels like a path you are walking. Buddhism teaches that this shift is the end of unnecessary suffering. Not because pain disappears, but because the fight against yourself finally ends. And when that fight ends, peace does not need to be forced. It simply appears. 11. Lasting peace emerges when you let go of the need to be seen, measured, and approved. Buddhism teaches that one of the deepest attachments of the human mind is the need to be seen in a certain way. Seen as successful, seen as worthy, seen as ahead, seen as admirable. Comparison strengthens this attachment by constantly asking how others see you and how you measure up in their eyes. As long as your peace depends on visibility, approval, or recognition, it remains fragile. The Buddha taught that suffering continues when the mind depends on external confirmation to feel whole. From an early age, most people are trained to seek approval. Praise becomes a signal of worth. Recognition becomes proof of value. Comparison naturally grows from this conditioning. You begin to observe not only what you do, but how it will be perceived. You measure your life not by how it feels, but by how it looks. Buddhism teaches that this outward orientation pulls the mind away from its own center. When attention is constantly directed outward, peace becomes impossible to stabilize. The need to be seen creates a subtle anxiety that follows you everywhere. You may appear confident on the surface, yet inside there is a constant monitoring of how you are perceived. Are you doing enough? Are you impressive enough? Are you progressing fast enough? Comparison feeds this anxiety endlessly because there is always someone receiving more attention, more praise, or more validation. The Buddha taught that this kind of craving is endless because it is rooted in fear rather than truth. When your sense of worth depends on approval, your behavior begins to change. You may hide your struggles to protect your image. You may exaggerate your strengths to feel secure. You may avoid taking risks that could make you look foolish. Buddhism teaches that living behind an image creates inner division. There is the self you present and the self you actually experience. This division is deeply exhausting and prevents genuine peace. Comparison also makes approval feel necessary for happiness. When you see others being praised or admired, the mind concludes that recognition is the source of their joy. You begin chasing visibility instead of alignment. Buddhism teaches that happiness does not come from being noticed. It comes from being at ease with oneself. Approval can feel pleasant, but it is unstable. The moment it fades, the mind returns to insecurity. When peace is tied to approval, it rises and falls beyond your control. The Buddha taught renunciation not as withdrawal from life, but as letting go of attachments that cause suffering. Letting go of the need to be seen is a powerful form of renunciation. It does not mean becoming invisible or indifferent. It means no longer needing the world to constantly confirm your worth. When this attachment loosens, a deep relief appears. You no longer need to perform. You no longer need to impress. You are free to be sincere instead of strategic. Comparison collapses when approval is no longer the goal. You stop asking how you rank and start asking how you feel. You begin measuring your life by inner states rather than external reactions. Are you more aware than before? Are you kinder? Are you less reactive? Are you more patient? Buddhism teaches that these inner shifts are signs of true progress, even if no one applauds them. Letting go of approval also restores authenticity. You speak more honestly because you are no longer tailoring your words to gain acceptance. You act more naturally because you are not constantly managing an image. Buddhism teaches that truthfulness is a path to peace because it removes inner conflict. When you are no longer trying to be seen as something specific, you relax into being what you are. Another profound change occurs when the need for approval fades. Relationships deepen. Comparison often turns relationships into stages for performance or competition. When you no longer need to be measured, you can listen fully. You can celebrate others without insecurity. You can be present without self-consciousness. Buddhism teaches that genuine connection arises when the self is not being defended or displayed. The Buddha also taught that praise and blame are part of worldly conditions. They come and go like weather. A mind attached to praise suffers when blamed. A mind unattached remains steady. When you stop needing approval, praise feels pleasant but not necessary. Criticism feels uncomfortable but not destructive. This emotional stability is a hallmark of lasting peace. Over time, letting go of comparison and approval changes your relationship with effort. You still work, create, and contribute, but not to prove yourself. Effort becomes an expression of care rather than a demand for recognition. Buddhism teaches that actions rooted in right intention carry less suffering. When the intention is sincerity rather than validation, the heart remains lighter. The deepest freedom comes when you realize that being unseen does not diminish your existence. You do not disappear when no one is watching. Your breath still moves, your awareness still functions, your life still unfolds. The Buddha taught that existence does not require an audience. When this truth is felt, not just understood, peace becomes independent of circumstances. In the end, lasting peace emerges when you stop outsourcing your worth to the eyes of others. Comparison loses its grip because there is nothing left to measure. You are no longer trying to be ahead, admired, or approved. You are simply here, living, learning, and responding to life as it unfolds. Buddhism teaches that this simplicity is not emptiness. It is freedom, a freedom that does not need to be seen to be real and does not need to be measured to be complete. 12. True liberation is living without needing to compare, correct, or complete yourself. Buddhism teaches that the final layer of suffering dissolves when the mind no longer believes it is broken, unfinished, or behind. Comparison survives because it convinces you that something is missing, that you must fix yourself, improve yourself, or reach a certain state before peace is allowed. This belief becomes so familiar that it feels like common sense. Yet the Buddha taught that this is one of the deepest misunderstandings of the human mind. Liberation does not come from completing yourself. It comes from realizing that you were never incomplete to begin with. Comparison constantly creates a subtle sense of lack. Even when life is stable, the mind whispers that it could be better if you were different. Even when you are growing, it suggests that growth is not fast enough. Even when you are peaceful, it reminds you that someone else seems more peaceful. Buddhism teaches that this constant inner commentary is not wisdom, it is conditioning. The mind has been trained to seek improvement instead of understanding, correction instead of acceptance, comparison instead of clarity. This creates a life lived in preparation rather than presence. You are always getting ready to be happy later. You postpone peace until you reach a better version of yourself. The Buddha taught that this postponement is the essence of suffering. As long as happiness is placed in the future, the present is treated as insufficient. Comparison keeps the present moment under constant judgment, never allowing it to be enough. One of the most radical Buddhist insights is that the self you are trying to improve is not fixed. It is a stream of experiences, thoughts, emotions, and sensations that are constantly changing. Comparison treats the self as a permanent object that can be measured, corrected, and ranked. This misunderstanding creates endless effort and frustration. When you realize that the self is a process rather than a product, the urge to compare begins to weaken. You stop asking whether you are complete and start observing what is happening. Liberation deepens when you see that comparison is driven by fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of being insignificant, fear of not becoming what you think you should be. Buddhism teaches that fear arises when the mind clings to imagined futures. Comparison lives entirely in imagined futures. It says, "If I don't catch up, I will lose." But when you return to the present, you see that nothing is actually lacking in this moment. Breath is happening. Awareness is present. Life is unfolding. The fear has no ground to stand on. Another layer of liberation appears when you stop trying to correct yourself. Comparison constantly highlights flaws. It tells you that who you are is a problem to be solved. Buddhism teaches that self-hatred disguised as self-improvement is still suffering. Growth rooted in rejection creates inner violence. Growth rooted in understanding creates peace. When you stop comparing, growth becomes gentle. You learn because you are curious, not because you are ashamed. You change because you care, not because you feel defective. The Buddha taught compassion not only toward others, but toward your own mind. When you see comparison arise, you do not need to fight it or judge it. You simply recognize it as a habit. This recognition itself is liberation in motion. You stop feeding the habit with belief. You stop acting from it. Over time, it weakens naturally. Buddhism teaches that what is not fed cannot survive. True liberation also means releasing the belief that life owes you a certain outcome. Comparison often comes from hidden expectations. You believe that effort should guarantee results, that virtue should guarantee peace, that growth should be visible and rewarded. When these expectations are unmet, comparison arises to explain the discomfort. Buddhism teaches that clinging to outcomes creates suffering because outcomes are never fully under your control. Liberation comes when you focus on presence and intention rather than comparison and reward. Living without comparison also transforms your relationship with effort. Effort becomes a form of care instead of pressure. You still act, plan, and grow, but without the sense that you are racing against others or against time. Buddhism teaches right effort as balanced, patient, and kind. When comparison falls away, effort no longer feels heavy. You move forward without carrying the weight of self-judgment. Another sign of liberation is the disappearance of urgency. Comparison creates urgency by convincing you that you are late. Buddhism teaches that urgency often blocks wisdom. When you feel rushed, you stop listening. You stop feeling. You stop understanding. When you no longer compare, urgency softens. You trust that learning unfolds step by step. You stop forcing insight and allow it to mature naturally. Liberation also brings a quiet confidence that does not announce itself. You no longer need to explain your path or defend your pace. You stop seeking permission to exist as you are. Buddhism teaches that dignity arises when the mind stops arguing with itself. This dignity is not pride, it is peace with one's own unfolding. As comparison dissolves, a deeper intimacy with life appears. You are no longer watching yourself from the outside, asking how you measure up. You are inside the experience, fully participating. Eating feels more vivid. Walking feels more grounded. Silence feels more alive. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is not an escape from life, but a return to it without distortion. In this state, happiness is no longer something you chase. It becomes a background condition of awareness, not excitement, not constant pleasure, but a deep okayness with existence as it is. You still feel pain, loss, and difficulty, but they no longer threaten your sense of worth. You are not trying to fix yourself through comparison. You are simply responding to life with clarity. The Buddha taught that liberation is simple, but not easy. It requires seeing through habits that have shaped the mind for years. Comparison is one of the strongest of these habits. But each moment of awareness weakens it. Each moment of presence replaces it. You do not need to eliminate comparison. You only need to stop believing it. In the end, true liberation is not becoming someone better. It is realizing that you do not need to become anyone else. You are allowed to exist, to learn, to grow, and to be at peace exactly where you are. When comparison finally loosens its grip, life no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like a path to walk. And in that walking, without measuring, correcting, or completing yourself, peace quietly becomes your natural state. 13. Peace deepens when you stop turning life into a scorecard and start living it fully. Buddhism teaches that one of the final illusions the mind must release is the habit of turning life into a scorecard. Comparison trains the mind to believe that life is something to be tracked, evaluated, and graded. Every experience becomes evidence for or against your worth. Every year becomes a measurement. Every achievement becomes a number on an invisible chart. This mindset is so common that it feels natural, yet the Buddha taught that it is one of the most subtle sources of dissatisfaction. As long as life is treated as a scorecard, peace remains conditional and incomplete. When the mind compares, it is never simply observing, it is judging. It asks whether this moment is good enough, whether this stage of life is acceptable, whether you are progressing at the right speed. Buddhism teaches that judgment fragments experience. Instead of fully being in a moment, you stand outside it, assessing its value. This creates distance between you and your own life. You are present physically, but mentally you are reviewing, ranking, and scoring. Over time, this separation creates a quiet emptiness, a sense that life is happening somewhere else while you are busy evaluating it. Turning life into a scorecard also robs experiences of their natural meaning. A simple moment of calm becomes insignificant if it cannot be compared to someone else's greater calm. A small step forward feels useless if someone else took a bigger step. Buddhism teaches that meaning does not come from comparison. It comes from direct experience. When you stop scoring life, moments regain their richness. A single breath becomes complete in itself. A small effort becomes honorable. A quiet day becomes enough. The scorecard mindset also creates chronic dissatisfaction because there is no final score. The mind never declares the game over. There is always another comparison, another standard, another expectation. Even joy becomes conditional. You may feel happy, but the mind interrupts and asks whether this happiness is as strong or as impressive as someone else's. The Buddha taught that happiness cannot survive constant evaluation. Joy arises when the mind relaxes its need to judge and allows experience to be what it is. Living without a scorecard does not mean losing direction. Buddhism does not reject growth, discipline, or effort. It rejects the idea that your value depends on measurable outcomes. When you release the scorecard, effort becomes sincere rather than performative. You work because the work matters to you, not because it will improve your ranking. You learn because learning feels alive, not because it will prove your worth. This shift transforms how life feels from the inside. Another way the scorecard mentality harms peace is by distorting memory. You begin remembering your past as a series of failures or missed opportunities instead of as a chain of lessons. Comparison encourages regret by constantly replaying what could have been done better relative to others. Buddhism teaches that clinging to the past is suffering because the past no longer exists. When you stop scoring life, memory softens. You see your past not as a verdict, but as a teacher. This compassion toward your own history creates emotional healing. The future also changes when comparison fades. Instead of feeling pressured to arrive somewhere quickly, you become curious about where the path leads. Buddhism teaches that anxiety is often the fear of an imagined future. Comparison feeds this fear by convincing you that falling behind will have permanent consequences. When you stop comparing, the future feels open instead of threatening. You trust that learning will continue, even if progress is uneven or slow. Living fully also means reclaiming your senses. Comparison keeps the mind abstract, lost in numbers and narratives. Buddhism teaches that peace grows when attention returns to the body and the present moment. When you stop scoring life, you feel more. You notice textures, sounds, and subtle emotions. You become less concerned with how life looks and more engaged with how it feels. This sensory presence brings a quiet joy that comparison can never offer. Another profound change occurs in how you handle difficulty. When life is a scorecard, difficulty feels like failure. You judge yourself for struggling. You compare your pain to others' strength and feel weak. Buddhism teaches that suffering is part of being human, not a personal flaw. When you stop comparing, difficulty becomes workable. You respond with patience instead of shame. This response reduces suffering even when challenges remain. The Buddha taught that wisdom is seeing things as they are. Comparison prevents this seeing by filtering experience through judgment. When you drop the scorecard, clarity increases. You see your life more accurately. You recognize what is nourishing and what is draining. You make decisions based on understanding rather than pressure. This clarity supports a peace that is grounded and realistic, not idealized. Living fully also changes how you relate to time. Comparison makes time feel like an enemy. You feel late, rushed, or behind. Buddhism teaches that time is simply change, not a threat. When you stop scoring life by milestones, time relaxes. You stop racing. You move at a pace that allows depth. This slower rhythm supports awareness and reduces inner conflict. As the scorecard dissolves, a deeper appreciation for ordinary life appears. You stop waiting for extraordinary moments to justify your existence. Eating, walking, resting, and breathing regain their dignity. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment is found in ordinary activities when they are lived without distortion. Comparison distorts the ordinary by dismissing it as insufficient. Letting go restores its value. Peace deepens because nothing is being compared anymore. There is no inner competition, no constant evaluation, no hidden pressure to be more, faster, or better. You are not trying to win at life. You are living it. This shift does not remove pain, but it removes unnecessary suffering. It allows joy to appear naturally without being measured or ranked. In the end, Buddhism points toward a simple truth. Life is not a test to pass or a game to win. It is an experience to be lived with awareness. When you stop turning life into a scorecard, you stop standing outside of it. You step back into your own experience fully. And in that full participation, without comparison, judgment, or ranking, peace becomes deeper, steadier, and more real than anything the mind could ever score. 14. Wholeness is remembered when you stop searching for what you think is missing. Buddhism teaches that the most painful misunderstanding the mind holds is the belief that something essential is missing from you. Comparison strengthens this belief quietly and persistently. Each time you look at another person's life and feel behind, incomplete, or lesser, the mind reinforces the idea that you are lacking something fundamental. Over time, this belief becomes so familiar that it feels like truth. Yet the Buddha taught that suffering does not come from lack itself, but from the belief in lack. Liberation begins when this belief is seen clearly and gently released. Comparison convinces you that wholeness is located somewhere else, in another stage of life, in another version of yourself, in another person's achievements, confidence, peace, or clarity. This creates a restless searching that never ends, because the mind is looking outward for something that can only be recognized inwardly. Buddhism teaches that wholeness is not something you acquire. It is something you remember when the mind stops fragmenting itself through judgment and comparison. This belief in missingness turns life into a constant self-improvement project driven by anxiety rather than wisdom. You begin treating yourself as a problem that must be solved. Every flaw feels urgent. Every delay feels dangerous. Every difference feels like evidence of failure. Buddhism teaches that this mindset creates endless tension because the self can never be perfected in the way the mind imagines. The more you try to fix yourself through comparison, the more fragmented you feel. The Buddha taught that the sense of self is constructed moment by moment through thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. Comparison disrupts this natural flow by freezing the self into a rigid image and then judging it. You decide who you are based on snapshots rather than the full movement of your life. This rigid self-image cannot grow naturally. It can only be defended or attacked. When you stop comparing, the self softens. It becomes fluid again. Growth becomes possible without self-rejection. Another way comparison creates the illusion of missingness is by ignoring context. You compare your inner experience to someone else's outer appearance. You compare your current chapter to someone else's highlight. You compare your struggles to their silence. Buddhism teaches that such comparisons are incomplete by nature. They strip away complexity and replace understanding with assumption. When you stop comparing, reality becomes more nuanced. You see that everyone carries unseen burdens and unfinished lessons. Wholeness also disappears when the mind splits experience into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Comparison encourages this split by labeling certain traits as superior and others as inferior. You begin rejecting aspects of yourself that do not fit an idealized image. Buddhism teaches that rejection creates suffering. What is rejected does not disappear. It hides, tightens, and resurfaces as anxiety, shame, or self-doubt. When you stop comparing, acceptance becomes possible. Acceptance does not mean approval of everything. It means allowing everything to exist without hostility. The Buddha emphasized that awareness itself is whole. It does not need improvement. It does not compete. It simply knows. When you rest in awareness rather than identity, the sense of missingness fades. You realize that the feeling of lack is a thought, not a fact. You begin to experience moments of completeness, even in imperfection. This is not optimism, it is clarity. Searching for what you think is missing also prevents you from recognizing what is already present. Comparison trains attention to scan for deficits instead of nourishment. You overlook resilience, effort, sincerity, and quiet growth because they do not compare favorably to someone else's visible success. Buddhism teaches gratitude as a form of wisdom because it restores balance to perception. When you stop comparing, gratitude arises naturally. You see your life more fully, without distortion. Another profound shift occurs when you stop using others as mirrors for self-evaluation. Comparison turns relationships into reflective surfaces instead of connections. You look at others to find evidence of your own worth or lack. Buddhism teaches that this habit blocks intimacy. When you stop comparing, you meet people as they are, not as measurements. This creates warmth, compassion, and genuine presence. Wholeness also deepens when you release the belief that your life must look a certain way to be valid. Comparison enforces narrow definitions of success, happiness, and progress. Buddhism teaches that clinging to fixed ideas causes suffering. When you let go of rigid expectations, life becomes more spacious. You allow your path to unfold in unexpected ways. This openness supports peace. The Buddha taught that the mind creates suffering by insisting that reality should be different. Comparison is one of the strongest forms of this insistence. It says, "This moment is not enough, this self is not enough, this life is not enough." When you stop comparing, this insistence weakens. You begin to meet life as it is. Not because it is perfect, but because resistance has softened. Wholeness is remembered gradually, not all at once. It appears in moments when you stop searching, in moments of quiet awareness, in moments when you allow yourself to be incomplete without feeling broken. Buddhism teaches that peace is not the absence of desire or difficulty, but the absence of inner division. Comparison creates division. Letting it go restores unity. In the end, the belief that something is missing is the final veil comparison places over the mind. When that veil lifts, nothing new is added, nothing is achieved, nothing is proven. You simply see clearly that you were never lacking what you thought you needed. Life was never withholding wholeness from you. The mind was just too busy comparing to recognize it. 15. Peace becomes effortless when you stop chasing a better version of yourself. Buddhism teaches that one of the most exhausting illusions the mind carries is the belief that there is a better version of you waiting somewhere in the future, and that peace depends on reaching that version. Comparison keeps this illusion alive. It constantly presents images of who you could be, should be, or must become by looking at others and measuring yourself against them. As long as you believe that peace belongs to a future self and not the present one, your life becomes a never-ending pursuit, and happiness is always delayed. The idea of a better version often sounds positive, even motivating, but Buddhism invites us to look more deeply. The question is not whether growth is good, but whether the motivation for growth is rooted in wisdom or dissatisfaction. Comparison-driven growth is fueled by rejection of the present self. It says, "Who I am now is not enough." This rejection creates tension at the core of your being. The Buddha taught that any action rooted in aversion, even aversion toward yourself, will lead to suffering. Chasing a better version of yourself means you are never fully here. Part of you is always standing in the present, while another part is running ahead, judging, pushing, and demanding. This split creates inner conflict. You may achieve goals, improve habits, and develop skills, yet still feel restless and unfulfilled because the mind has learned to withhold peace until a future condition is met. Buddhism teaches that peace cannot be postponed without being lost, because peace exists only in the present moment. Comparison intensifies this chase by constantly redefining what better means. When you improve, the mind quickly finds someone who appears more advanced, more disciplined, more enlightened, or more successful. The finish line moves again. The better version of you is always just out of reach. The Buddha described this as chasing desire without end, a cycle that keeps beings trapped in dissatisfaction. The problem is not effort. The problem is effort that never allows rest. Another hidden cost of chasing a better version of yourself is self-violence. You push yourself harshly. You criticize your flaws relentlessly. You treat mistakes as evidence that you are failing rather than learning. Buddhism teaches compassion as a foundation for awakening, because harshness hardens the mind. When the inner voice becomes aggressive, peace becomes impossible. Comparison trains that aggressive voice by constantly highlighting where you fall short. The Buddha taught that transformation happens through understanding, not force. When you stop comparing, you begin to understand yourself more clearly. You notice patterns without judgment. You recognize limitations without shame. You see growth as a natural unfolding rather than a desperate race. This understanding creates space for real change, change that is stable and kind rather than frantic and fragile. Chasing a better version of yourself also disconnects you from your inherent worth. You begin to believe that value must be earned through improvement. Buddhism teaches that worth is not a reward. It is not something granted after achievement. Awareness itself has dignity. Life itself has value. When you stop chasing, this truth begins to settle into your experience. You realize that growth does not add worth. It expresses it. Another way this chase creates suffering is by turning self-reflection into self-judgment. Instead of observing yourself with curiosity, you constantly evaluate whether you are becoming enough. Buddhism teaches that awareness is like a mirror. It reflects without condemning. Comparison turns that mirror into a weapon. When you let go of comparison, self-reflection becomes gentle again. You learn from experience without turning it into a verdict on your character. Peace becomes effortless when you stop chasing, because effort itself changes quality. You still make effort, but it is no longer driven by anxiety. You study, practice, and work because it feels meaningful, not because you are trying to escape who you are. The Buddha described right effort as balanced, neither forcing nor neglecting. This balance is impossible when comparison dominates, because comparison always demands more. Another profound shift happens in how you relate to failure. When you are chasing a better version of yourself, failure feels dangerous. It threatens your future peace. Buddhism teaches that failure is simply information. When comparison falls away, mistakes lose their emotional charge. You correct course without self-punishment. This reduces suffering and increases wisdom. The chase for a better self also keeps the mind in constant anticipation. You are always waiting to arrive. Buddhism teaches that awakening is not arrival, but presence. When you stop chasing, you begin to notice that moments of peace have always been available. They were just overlooked because the mind was too busy running ahead. Stopping the chase does not mean stagnation. It means growth without hostility. You still evolve, but you do so from acceptance rather than rejection. This is a crucial Buddhist insight. Acceptance is not the opposite of change. It is the ground from which healthy change arises. When you accept yourself as you are, change becomes organic instead of forced. As comparison loosens its grip, a quiet joy begins to appear. Not excitement, not pride, but a sense of ease. You feel less pressured to become someone else. You feel more at home in your own life. The Buddha taught that this ease is a sign of the path unfolding correctly. When striving softens, clarity deepens. In the end, peace becomes effortless, not because life becomes perfect, but because you stop demanding perfection from yourself. You stop chasing an imagined future self and begin living as the real, evolving, imperfect human being you already are. Buddhism teaches that liberation is not becoming better than others or even better than yourself. It is becoming free from the belief that you must be someone else to be at peace. Buddhism teaches that suffering does not end when life becomes perfect, but when the mind stops demanding perfection. Throughout these teachings, one truth becomes clear again and again. Comparison is not helping you grow, protect you, or guide you. It is quietly draining your peace, fragmenting your attention, and convincing you that happiness belongs somewhere else. As long as you measure your life against others, you will always feel incomplete because comparison has no finish line. There will always be someone ahead in some way, and the mind will always find a new reason to withhold peace. True happiness begins when you stop outsourcing your worth to timelines, achievements, appearances, or approval. The Buddha did not teach liberation through becoming more impressive, more successful, or more advanced than others. He taught liberation through seeing clearly, seeing that the mind's habit of comparison is not truth, seeing that your life does not need to look like anyone else's to be meaningful, seeing that peace is not a reward for reaching a future version of yourself, but a natural state that appears when resistance ends. When comparison falls away, effort becomes lighter, growth becomes kinder, and life becomes more intimate. You stop living as a judge of yourself and start living as a witness to your own unfolding. You no longer need to rush, prove, or compete. You begin to trust your path, honor your timing, and accept your humanity without hostility. This acceptance does not weaken you, it steadies you. Buddhism teaches that freedom is not found by fixing yourself, but by understanding yourself, not by completing yourself, but by realizing you were never broken. When you stop comparing, you stop fighting who you are. And when that fight ends, something profound happens. Peace stops being something you chase and becomes something you allow. You were never meant to live as a measurement. You were meant to live as a presence. When you release comparison, you return to this presence, breath by breath, step by step, moment by moment. And in that return, happiness is no longer delayed, it is already here.